Hey, welcome to Overtime, where we take Sunday's message further. My name is Jeremy, and I'm your host. And this is a podcast where we just want to ask the questions that we think that you would ask as it relates to Sunday's message. And as we do so, we hope that it helps you grow in your life and your faith. With that being said, be sure to hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all of the podcasts that are coming out. Not only that, hit the like button, because when you do so, it helps us help other people. And if you ever have a question about Sunday's content or about Overtime, you can submit those to overtime@npaustin.com, and we will be sure to get to those in future podcasts. So with that being said, here's a quick recap of Sunday, and then we're going to jump into our conversation today.
This is where we'll pick up where we left off last week. You get to what I call spiritual treadmill. Jesus, what more can I do? It's not about doing more for me. It's about being with me. And so that moves us from trail marker 3 to 4, a deeper love for Jesus. You start to think, just give me Jesus. You know, the Apostle Paul begins to describe what happens experientially. He says, I once thought these things were valuable, but now I consider them worthless when compared with the infinite value of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. This totally makes sense. Be still and know that I'm God. You're like, of course. And as that begins to happen, you move from trail marker 4 to trail marker 5, this longing for oneness with God. And the resting place of his love will become the very source of your life. And now you move in to trail marker number 6, God's transforming love. Paul says in Romans 12, don't copy the behavior of the customs of the world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way you think, eventually to what he invites you into, which is a love relationship with God.
Well, Craig, thank you so much for saying yes to this. I think you said yes like yesterday.
Yes.
To jump on the podcast today.
I did.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome.
And I'm actually really excited for this topic that we're going to talk about for a number of reasons. One, we were just talking about this a second ago. You were our very first podcast, and you
with
and
Jen.
With Jen, you and your wife Jen, and y'all shared your story, and that was a great podcast. And we've gotten our podcasting together a little bit more since then, and we know a little bit more of what we're doing at this point. But you also, it's just interesting, you know, given this topic, we're going through this, or we're wrapped up the series, you are here talking about kind of a roadmap for spiritual growth and formation. And, you know, what is faith like from the beginning to faith like, 5 decades later and following Jesus, one's entire life. And it's a really interesting discussion. And one of the reasons we wanted to ask you to be on this, we were talking cars just a second ago before Josh hit record on the podcast.
Right. And
you're talking about getting this car that you're going to restore, and you just made a comment, and I was like, I'm so excited to have this conversation. You just said, but I was talking to God about it, and God was like, Craig, I'm going to teach you some stuff through this, restoring this car.
Yep. And
that's the very reason why we wanted you on this podcast, is because me being on the other side of you just embody Jesus and your faith and God are not this separate thing in your life. I mean, even down to buying a car that you're going to restore, that's a part of your relationship with God. I mean, you don't seem to go anywhere or do anything apart from him. And I've experienced the same thing on the other side of Jen as well. Mm-hmm. And so I think, y'all are just amazing people. And, if I can learn something from you in the next 45 minutes or 30 minutes, however long we talk, if people listening can, then we're just grateful. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about you, what you do, your family, all that stuff?
Yeah. So you've already mentioned a little bit. I am married. Jen and I have been married 21 years. We have, I affectionately say we have 5 kids. We have 2 two-legged and 3 four-legged. So
nice. Those kind of add up.
Yeah, exactly. They it's the same amount of time, just in different ways.
Sure.
But yeah, we have 2 daughters. Abby was a senior at Vista, and then Hannah is a sophomore at iUniversity Prep, which is an all-virtual school, which is kind of cool. And then we have a small, medium, and large dog.
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice. And what do you do for a living?
Yeah, I work for Apple. I guess I can say that.
Little company.
Little company.
Kind of known.
Yep. And what I do for them is I'm a manager for them. I work in one of their contact centers. So teams I support do all post-sale support for the online store. So our largest store that we have. Yeah.
And you've been working there for how long?
16 years.
16
so
years.
Actually, fun fact, I started Apple on Abby's 2nd birthday.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
So
May 15th, 2006.
So her whole life has been Dad works at Apple.
Yeah, pretty much.
That's cool.
Yeah.
Now I'm an Apple geek. You know, I've messaged you multiple times about, hey, can I use your discount? That kind of thing.
Yep.
But to people who are on the outside of Apple, it's like, oh, you work at Apple. What is it like? Like, what is it really like to work at Apple? I mean, everybody just, you know, Apple's such a cool company.
Yeah, I had worked for 2 other companies before I started working there, and I say this, and this was really my thought. My first day there, it was like meeting Jen for the first time. Like, I had dated, you know, other girls before I met Jen, but when I met Jen, I was like, okay, yeah, like this is the woman I want to spend the rest of my life with. And so that first day at Apple felt like, okay, this is the company I'm going to retire from.
Wow. So it was all it like has shaken up to be. Like, you've experienced that.
Yeah, I think it's a culture fit more than anything else. I mean, just the culture of the business, how intentional they are with their employees and with their customers, and just the whole ideology around work. And the balance between work and life, and how they prioritize what we do and what we focus on. Just really, really fit. And not to disparage my previous employers, but like, when you see something being done, you're like, okay, whether that's right or wrong, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And then when you see it in a way that's like, oh, wow, like this is the way it should be done, it just connects. And I connected with the work, I connected with the people. And yeah, after 16 years, it's like, okay, I think I'm in it for the long haul.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's been a great company. I've had a lot of great opportunities working for them. I've learned a lot about myself, learned a lot about how to lead effectively, and it hasn't been perfect. It hasn't been like this, you know, honeymoon for 16 years. I mean, there's definitely been moments where I've like questioned, okay, is now the time to leave? Is it not? But you know, one of the things that we do there is spend a lot of time talking about, okay, what is the right thing to do? And like, why should we do it? And one of the things that has been said before is we say no to, 10,000 good things so we can say yes to the right 2 or 3 things, and the right great things. So it's about prioritizing and focusing on what really, really matters. And there's lots of good things that happen. And I kind of see a similar parallel story with our spiritual life and our life with God too. Like, there's lots of good things that you can do in life that are not necessarily bad in themselves, and they're really good things, but they can sometimes take away from the journey that God's placed you on. And you mentioned earlier about like me being intentional with my decision making and involving God in decision making. It's because I want to ensure that whatever decision I make, it's in alignment with what He has planned for me.
Yeah.
And I know that whatever the result of that is, if I follow that path, then I know that's not saying everything's going to be great and that I won't have any issues, but I know that it will be in accordance with what He has planned for me, and that on the other side of that and through that, I'm going to become closer to the person He created me to be. So yeah, when I went to buy the car, I was like, God, this is, it only was like, even though the money was not a significant investment, relatively.
Sure.
I knew that I was stepping into this journey of like never having experienced this before, and like, okay, I need help, and I need to make sure that this is what I need to be doing, because it's a time investment, not necessarily a money investment. And with the girls finishing high school and then moving on to college, like I want to make sure that I'm spending my time appropriately as well. So just having a good understanding of what I'm signing up for was really, really important.
Yeah, for sure. So talking about, you are here, this series we're in, even hearing you talk a little bit about, just your decision-making process now, your faith life now, we've broken it up into these trail markers, 1 through 7 or 0 through 7, I guess I should say. Mm-hmm. If you were to summarize, and I know there's, a lot of life you've lived, a lot of things you've experienced, but if you were to summarize kind of your faith journey, maybe how it started and maybe just some moments that have led you to where you are today,
mm-hmm.
would you be able to kind of just talk some people through who haven't heard that before?
Yeah.
Because then I want to pick up kind of where you are today, because I've got some questions relating to our content with part 4 of this series. But I want us to kind of have the backstory, to play off of a little bit.
Yeah. So I was born into the church. So my parents were also raised in the church. They both were raised Southern Baptist. When they married, they found themselves in the Methodist church. And so when I was born, I was baptized Methodist. And we were there till I was about probably 6 or 7. And I remember I didn't like going into like kids' church. I much preferred to stay with my parents. But then I didn't really engage with, because it was sermons directed towards my parents, right?
Sure,
and their
sure.
age. And so I remember drawing a lot and playing with my older brother in church. As much as my parents would let us do that. But when we, around first grade, second grade time frame, my parents decided they were going to try different denominations. So we went to the Episcopal Church, and I fell in love with the service, the liturgy. Part of it was I could participate, because the Episcopal Church is very similar. I say that it's Catholic without the Pope. It's like Catholic light. And so there's, Diet Catholic, however you want to say it. But the kids can participate, right? So there's things for them to do, acolytes and things like that. So I really connected with the service because I could do things and participate. I really fell in love with the liturgy. And that's where we stayed. That's actually what moved to Texas. I was in youth group with them and, did mission trips with them. We moved to Texas in between my sophomore and junior year of high school, because my dad came to seminary here in Austin, and he had felt the call of the ministry, and so he became an Episcopal priest when I was in high. Well, I had graduated by that time, because I graduated before he did, but stayed with the Episcopal Church. When I was in high school, it was a major culture shock coming from, because I grew up in Louisiana. If you put a little dot and drew a 5 mile circle around that's pretty much every house I ever lived in was in that circle, and that was my whole life. And then we moved to Texas, and it was a real big culture shock for me.
There's burnt orange everywhere. It's not purple and gold. Is that what it is? Purple and yellow?
Purple and gold, yeah.
Gold.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's LSU's not the only school in Louisiana, but it is the best.
Sure.
So we moved here, in the high school we were at Round Rock, and the high school there was huge. It was like a small college campus for me. My whole high school in Louisiana maybe had 1,000 kids when I was there. I had 640-something people in my class at Round Rock. So it was like a major shift for me. Everybody played a sport. Everybody was involved with something. And so I kind of withdrew a little bit into a small circle of people that I had met within the high school. And we just did the teenager stuff. I wasn't going to school. I wasn't going to church really. And my life and my relationship with God at that point was kind of put to the side. I never went to a point where I was like, I don't believe in you. I don't want to have anything to do with you. It's just it's not. I didn't prioritize that. And so late teens, early 20s, a lot of my time was spent just doing that single dude stuff.
Sure.
Partying and hanging out with friends and all that stuff. And then when I was in my early 20s, my parents moved back to Austin. Dad was had taken a job at St. Luke's on the Lake Episcopal Church. And my parents were like, hey, really, my mom in particular was like, hey, could you please just come back to church? We're here now and we'd love to see you. So I started working, going back there, and I started working with the youth as a volunteer. And met some fantastic people, had some great experiences. Part of that was me meeting Jen. She'd grown up in this church. She had come back. She was in college at that time, but she'd come back for an internship. She was going to be working with the youth as an intern. And we met at a Good Friday lock-in. I don't even know if people know what lock-ins are, but, back then it was kind of the thing. And we just kind of fell in love. And so we decided to get married and got married in 2000. Still worked with the youth. Our honeymoon was spent on a mission trip. So that time frame, really God was getting me more involved with not only, it was very much in that kind of do phase. Like that was my mode, is like, what can I do for God? But I was in conversation with him about, even prayerfully, like, hey, is Jen the right person for me? And that's why we got engaged so quickly, because I really felt like God was like, hey, this is the woman that you're going to spend the rest of your life with. So early marriage, we still were involved a lot with the church. And then she started working for the church. At that point, was a nursery director there for St. Luke's for a while. Started having kids. And all of that time frame, I would say, in the context of like the mansions side, I was still very much like in that 3 to 4 stage.
The trail marker where you're like,
where I was still very focused on what I could do. And like the more I did and the more I learned, the more I studied, the more I would know about God, and that would be the closer I would become to him.
Yeah.
And then you fast forward through some pretty hard stuff in our marriage that we talked about in our first podcast.
Sure.
So if you're interested, you can go back and watch that.
Yeah.
Just for the concept of time.
Yeah.
And then, you know, that was when it kind of really shook me, like, okay, like it's not about what I could do. It's about who God was creating me to be. In 2014, I went to a Wild at Heart boot camp, and that was the first time that God really got in my face about, like, okay, it's time to grow up. You know, it's time to move off of no more milk, like it's time to get some meat, and began to show me what it meant to look to him as a father, as opposed to like this deity that, you know, it's not more about reverence, but more about intimacy and intimate relationship. Like that wasn't a category I had before that time frame.
Sure.
And in the process of doing that was also helping me through my relationship with my earthly father, tying it into that. And then we went, so in the way it's been for me is that God gives me a little bit of piece of something, and like I chew on that for a little while, and it kind of like let it kind of permeate and kind of settle in, and then it gets me another piece and then another piece, regardless of like whether I'm asking for another one or not. Like I think he's really kind of been kind about, okay, leading me through these different stages, as opposed to like me forcing that, or like, okay, I've got a 10-year plan, God, that by the end of that 10-year period, I'm going to be here.
Yeah.
That's just not how it works, or that's not how it worked for me.
Yeah.
And then in 2016, my mother was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and that just shook my world, because I knew that was a death sentence for my mom, but I didn't know how long I was going to have with her. Mm-hmm. And that was really, really hard for me. Spring of 2017, I went to an advanced boot camp, which in that time frame, God kind of led me through healing my relationship with my mom, which was fantastic, because she died that summer. So had I not had that experience in the spring, I would not have been able to say goodbye to my mom properly in the summer, because I was so angry with her about, you know, trauma and stuff that I experienced as a kid, that had I not been able to be healed from that, I would not have been able to love her fully and say goodbye properly, at least for now, you know, that summer. So that was a real blessing. And I also I have an autoimmune disorder that got crazy that year. A lot of autoimmunes are triggered by stress, and so there was a lot of stress with that.
Sure.
And then when Mom died, that summer, we had 6 deaths in 2 months that were close to us. So Mom was just one of those 6. And like it was just way too much for my body to handle, my emotions to handle either. And so that was kind of a real dark time for me, emotionally and physically. And my best friend, his mom was diagnosed with cancer that year, which was this was after my mom passed. So like on the heels of that, like I find out like, and this is a lady that was like my second mom, you know, like we grew up together, and she passed away the following year, and I wasn't able to go to her funeral because I was in the hospital. Like my autoimmune had, one of the side effects of that was I carried a lot of weight, and I had over 50 pounds of like water weight. And so it was so bad that they had me in the hospital on IV diuretics to try to get the water off. And so the day I went to the hospital was the day that, you know, she died.
Oh my gosh.
So I wasn't able to go to the funeral because I was in the hospital. And so like, it was in these times that like, I remember questioning like, okay, seriously, like how much more? And at no point in this was I was like, okay, like this whole God thing just isn't for me, or like I've never been able to get to a place where I don't believe in this. If anything, it's pushed me more towards that story in the gospel where Jesus is like, okay, unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, you can't become my disciple. And that was like a hard thing. And all these people left. And so he's left with the disciples, and he's like, okay, are y'all going to leave too? And Peter's like, where can we go?
Yeah.
Right. You have the words of eternal life. Like there's nowhere else for us to go. And that I really lived that out through that time, because that I felt the same way. Like, okay, I've gone all in, you know, at this point, and there's nowhere else for me to go. So like, I just have to ride this out and just stay with you and figure out like, what is this going to look like as we move forward? And so I went through a series of treatments that fall that put me in remission. And, 2018, 2019, we moved in 2019, and that's like COVID, right?
Yeah.
And then me being home, like I had a relapse with the whole porn stuff. And so that got me into counseling, like for real this time, because I tried counseling before and just didn't take it seriously. And so, but I was really focused on like hardcore counseling at this point. So I was ready. Like, and I remember pushing my counselor saying, okay, like, let's get past like the get to know you stuff and like, let's get to the work. Like I'm ready to do the work. Let's do the work.
Yeah.
And I remember him at times going, hey, like, yes, there's a part of like doing the work, but part of that doing the work is like letting that work change you, and like sitting with God in this and allowing it to really, really work. Mm-hmm. You know, like there's only so much you can do. Like there's a lot of prayer, there's a lot of reflection, a lot of contemplation that kind of goes through that process. And then we had some great, and that was probably in recent memory, one of the best things that's ever happened to me is that experience. Because through those conversations and having someone just listen and then kind of reflect back and just ask some really, really good questions, exposed a lot that I thought was already taken care of.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so I was really thankful for that experience. And unfortunately, he passed. And I remember, that being like a just complete gut shot. Like I felt like God was like, okay, so now you're done. And I was like, that's a really extreme done.
Yeah.
That's a really extreme choice that I still haven't properly grieved all that officially. I don't think we're still talking about that. But I know that through this experience, like God has just drawn me deeper into himself.
Yeah.
And these experiences have been, traumatic is probably the right word. I mean, there's trauma, and they've been stressful, but it's pushed me more, like I've wanted to gravitate more towards him, and like, okay,
like a refinement.
Yeah, like that's a really good word. Refinement. That's a really yeah. Like it didn't feel like that at the time. It felt more like being sifted.
Yeah, sifted.
But he really is kind. So that's a long. There's lots of like more detail in there that they can kind of tease out, I think.
Sure.
Through this conversation, but I think that's a really good overview.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Well, thank you. I know you've been in a lot of groups here at Northpoint and LDGs, and it's like, all right, story time, and how many times have you? But I really appreciate you, going through that.
Yeah.
Here, there. There's a couple specific parts, and but I want to drill down on, and one of those you already mentioned, and it's interesting. It's really interesting to hear you kind of talk about your whole story, because you said, and that's where I shifted from like doing all these things for God to really just be, and then from then on in your story, it really was just, and then this happened to me, and then this happened to me, and none of it was, and then I did this, and then I did this. It was like I experienced this, and then so what if we're talking, if you're sitting down with a group of people and they're going, man, I've always equated doing for God being like I'm good with God, and they're trying to go, I want to start shifting to that whole like being thing, but experientially, what is that even like? Can you provide some tools or handles for people?
Yeah, I think one of the I like to read a lot, and I want to be real cautious about suggesting people books, because I read something or heard something recently, and I don't know if this was Dallas Willard that said this, but it was Dr. Allender that mentioned it, that it's better to read a small amount of books deeply than a lot of them very superficially. And so I'm really cautious about like saying, oh, try this book and try this book, because I think it's important to like read the same book over and over and over again. And LDG has really showed that to me. Like I used to be the person like, okay, I've already read that, like I've done it. And I would watch like movies over and over and over again, but like the only book that I would read over and over and over again was the Bible. But when doing LDG, I was like, hey, like reading these same books over and over again, like they are different. Like even something so simple as the first one that we are assigned to, like
Bo's Cafe.
Yeah, it's like I wasn't sure if we could say it, like because it was.
Oh yeah.
But okay.
Well, I don't know if we can, but we did.
Yeah, like even something so seemingly simple as that book, like every time I read it, there's God's like bringing something else up in me that it touches me in a new way.
Yeah.
So I would say one of those books is Sky Jachani's book, With, was really good at describing the different types of relationships with God. And for me, I had to shift from seeing God as a deity to be worshipped, to be like, so a really good example, and this is something that just recently came to me. So Old Testament, God, lots of words for God in the Hebrew, right? God Almighty, Yahweh, like God present, all these different words, El Shaddai, right? The everlasting God. It wasn't until Jesus came that we could call him Father. And I had a very deep connection and respect for the Jewish tradition. And like to me, there was nobody closer to God outside of Christianity, right? And so like when God brought that to my attention just recently, I was like, wow, like the people that you chose to be your people who've been doing all this thing, they never called you Father. And that was so hard for them to understand when Jesus came. It was like, hey, this is your dad, like this is your father, this is Abba. They didn't even have a category for that.
Yeah.
Because it was all about doing. It was all about like, okay, follow the law. Like be righteous by doing these things. And Jesus was like, no, it's about relationship. And relationships, there's things that you do as part of that relationship, but what's primary is being intimate, like being connected. And through Jesus, we have that access to God. And that was a major shift for me to go, okay, it's not about what I do, because what I do is really ineffective and inconsequential in the grand scheme of things.
Right.
But God is wanting my heart. He wants full access to who I am, and to look at him as Father and how I viewed him as Father, and developing that relationship and allowing him to father me is what shifted it for me from doing to being with him, and then waiting and listening, like actually like not saying, hey, God, can you do this and this and this and this and this? It's more like, okay, God, what do you have for me? Like, what are you trying to show me? And it was a different interpretation of events too, right? Like if you live in a posture of, so another good resource, I want to say a lot of resources, I'm trying to kind of trim them down here, but like Henry Nouwen's book, The Life of the Beloved, is really good because he talks about the 3 myths of identity. I am what I have, I am what I do, I am what others say about me. And those are 3 lies that we tell ourselves, and the world tells us as well. But God tells us who we are by the very nature of being his children. Like, we're the beloved of God, and that's our identity. Mm-hmm. And the more we live into that identity and actually accept that and try to live out through that identity, the closer that's the first, and I think that's probably the doorway between like those lower trail markers and the higher trail markers.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that was, for me anyway, that was when I made that shift. And I was like, okay, God, like I accept you as my father. I recognize you as my father. Now I want you to father me. I'm ready.
Yeah.
And then moving into that, like, okay, so now what?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wait.
Yeah. And it's really interesting. There's a whole lot we can pull from what you just said. I will say we do a great job of throwing out a lot of books on this podcast. We throw out books all the time. That's because, I mean, we like to read around here, but I've actually experienced this. This is really neither here nor there. I've experienced the same thing of what you're saying, where I've set goals a couple of years ago, like I'm going to read 50 books this year, like a book a week. And I don't remember any of those books. Yeah. But there's been other, when I don't set a goal and I'm just reading to really like glean wisdom and learn, man, those books, like those things have lived on with me for, since I read them pretty much. So I would agree with that. Like, even though I am a culprit of throwing out so many books because I love to read. Yeah. Read for quality, not quantity, I think is a good approach. It's really interesting hearing you talk, because I think the dichotomy, and I talked to Jamie Iverson about this last week on the podcast as well, is to shift from being to doing. Our automatic assumption is, what do I do to be? Because I don't want to do anymore, so what do I do? You know what I mean? So we find ourselves in this rut. But I love what you said. It was a shift of, God, you just teach me, essentially. So instead of going, what do I do? It's kind of opening your hand. It's a posture. It's not doing anything. It's going, God, I'm ready to learn now. I've tried to do my way to get to your approval. I'm ready to learn what you have for me. And it seems like in that stage, because what you described is a little bit maybe something different than what I've experienced in that stage of my faith, and what God has taught me in that faith of me going, God, I want to learn from you now. I'm really tired of trying to earn your love. Can you just teach me at this point? And it's opening our hands and going, God, what do you have? And now, it is a little weird at first. And it's like, well, this is so paradoxical, so counterintuitive. But, now I would say there are moments when, even after doing that, I don't know, a couple of years for me now personally of going, God, what do you have for me? What do you want to teach me today? There are moments when I go, all I get is his presence. And I'm like, oh, that's really all I needed. Like, just a glimmer, just a second of like sitting in God's presence and early in the morning in the stillness and the quiet. And I go, oh man, I was asking for all these answers that I needed from him, and really I didn't need any of the answers. I just needed him for a moment. You know what I mean? And those are those moments where all of a sudden the light bulb goes off and you go, oh, this is what being with God is like. This is what like walking with him. I don't know if you had anything to add to any of what I just said.
Well, what I felt in that moment, and your dad now, I heard this a few years ago, and I never really understood it until I started practicing it. But we bring, as men and fathers, one of our greatest gifts we have is our presence, right? And that we don't necessarily have to say anything, necessarily do anything, but just being in the room like our physical presence brings with it things that words can't express. And we, in the world today, we have this absence of fatherhood. Full disclosure, I'm somewhat of an orphan. My dad chased his job. He chased money. He chased things that he would make him feel good. He didn't have, he himself was an orphan. His dad and parents were not like really involved with his life. And so he spent chasing their approval, chasing like that feeling of connectedness and relationship. And so dad got his feeling of self-worth from accomplishments and like promotions and bank account, right? And you sacrifice, there's only so much time in the day, and you sacrifice for what you choose to follow, what you choose to do. These micro decisions you make have impacts and cascades. And so when you say presence, like the Father's presence, like we bring that as well. Yeah. And to our wives and to our children and to people that we work with and people that we spend time with. And that's one of the things that for me has been a hard lesson, because my natural, like what I jokingly say that I don't like people. And if that's not necessarily true, I love seeing what God's doing in people's lives. I don't always feel adequately prepared to play the part that he wants me to play, because there's a very close line between what I've chased as validation for myself and what God's called me to do. And so I always have to like really check myself of like, okay, is this me saying yes because I need validation? Or am I saying yes because God's actually asking me to step into this person's life and speak wisdom or to provide my presence? So it's like this fine line. We have to be careful. Like, so the reason why I finished with that is because I started by saying, hey, we just need to be present, but we need to make sure that we're present for the right reason. And part of it is what God has ordained us to be as fathers and husbands, but also it's through our relationship with him. And this is another shift between doing and being, is where does it start? Like what's the originating thing and what's the goal? If your goal is like, oh, I want to be close to God, so I need to do these things, then that kind of moves into this mode of, okay, well, I need to accomplish 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then I'll be close to God. But if your goal is a deeper relationship with him and it's unity with the Father, like if your goal is like, I want to be spiritually mature, that's not a goal. That's a byproduct of being close to the Father and being in relationship with him. And it originates from an inside out, not an outside in, for like direction. Yeah. And I think part of that is like you talked about, sitting and just being in his presence. And that's really hard to do because that requires 3 things. It requires solitude, with being alone. It requires stillness, which means not being distracted, and it requires silence. And I can be in a room full of people, like that Christmas party we were talking about earlier. Oh, yeah. Where there's just all this silence, right? I mean, like there's all this craziness going on. And I can be still, and I can be alone in a crowd full of people. But my mind is never really silent. My mind is constantly going. So I can be in a room on my couch, like alone for hours, but my mind is not silent. And some people struggle with being still. Some people struggle with being alone. But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely, right? So I think that those 3 things are key in that with and that being phase, is you have to practice all 3 of those. And you're going to struggle with at least one of those, if not multiples. Yeah. But it's not necessarily perfection. We're seeking it's God's presence.
Yeah. And it is, so you said solitude, being alone, being still, and being silent are kind of those three things. You put those three things together, God meets you in those moments, in some ways. And it is interesting. Like, I think we all do. Like, I would agree with you. I probably struggle more with the mind, like allowing my mind to be still. And, but I think there's probably a handful of people that would go, no, being alone, that's the worst thing.
Yeah.
And so it's probably different for everybody in terms of, what, and I bet there's something that God has for every single person as a result of submitting those things to him.
Yep.
And going, God, I really don't want to be still. I really don't want to be alone. But I'm going to do it because I want to know what you have for me,
Yeah. For me, it was hard to hear God's voice when I was constantly talking.
100%. Yeah. You can't hear anything when you're constantly talking.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things you phrase sentences as if, God brought me here, God taught me this, God did this. At some point in our faith journey, it kind of shifts from us going to God to us kind of open-handed way, going like, God, what do you have for me? And that's one of the things that we didn't hit on a ton in the series because there was just so much content to hit in the series. But it really does seem experientially like you can do a lot in trail markers 0, 1, 2, 3, but it's not really up to us, to go from there. It's kind of a heart shift that God does in us. And it's that posture again, just learning and going, God, what do you have for me? And then allowing him to bring you through those trail markers, allowing him to guide you and bring, do the work in you, that inside out kind of approach. How have you experienced that? God kind of, you've talked about that a little bit already, but how would you kind of go back to it, explain it, God bringing us through these instead of us bringing ourselves through these?
I had to release my plan for my life. And I had to submit my hopes and dreams and my plots and schemes to God. In the sense of like, okay, if I really want to wait on you, and if I want you to direct me, that means I need to wait on you and not move until you say move. And it's harder on some people than it is on others. For me, I have this constant need for information. Like, there's this movie back in the 80s, that's Short Circuit, where he's reading these books and he's just like input and he's like just rifling through these books and just taking in information. That's part of my thing that I fight against is I could follow go deep down rabbit trails just because it's just something I never knew before or experienced before, and so I gotta know more about that. But God's like, okay, I want that. Instead of you chasing those things, sit with me for a moment and it's like, I liken this spiritual journey to going to the beach. And I've used this analogy before. There's people that have never been to the beach and never want to go to the beach. They've never experienced it, but what they've heard of it doesn't sound fun. And so they're like, I'm not a beach person. But they've never been to the beach.
Yeah.
And then there's those that have been to the beach and had a horrible experience. Like, my wife doesn't like camping because the only time she went camping was a horrible experience. And that's not really fair because it was just a bad experience. And maybe it was just a bad day or it was just the wrong beach. But there are those that do go that never get into the water. Right? They'll just go onto the sand and maybe sit and read a book. Me personally, when I go to the beach with Jen, she likes to read, I'll read, but I like to just sit there and just watch the water and watch people. Like just be present in the moment.
Yeah.
And that's really hard in my normal life because there's so much stuff going on to be present, because I'm usually focused on the future, like thinking about these possibilities of things as opposed to like being focused on the here and the now. And that's another thing that God's kind of like, it's that with life, that being life is being present to that present moment. So contemplative prayer, which we haven't really talked about, is a fantastic tool for that. But then you have people that go out into the water and they only go like ankle deep, get their feet wet, go back out. But a few years ago, God was like, hey, I'm calling you into deeper waters. And like, meaning I'm going to call you out into the ocean where you can't touch and you can't see the bottom. And that is absolutely frightening, because I've got this big fear of sharks. Like I had this terrible fear of sharks, like this inordinate fear of sharks.
Do you scan the water for like fins? Are you like, oh, is that a fin?
Yeah, I don't like to turn my back a lot to the open water. I will at times, but like I most like to like face out, because in my mind I'm thinking, okay, I'm gonna see them coming in, not realizing that. I mean, intellectually, I know that they swim behind me. Like that, we reached a vacation in Daytona Beach, which Volusia County is the shark attack capital of the world, or the United States. More shark attacks happen there than anywhere else in the United States, including Hawaii. And but I went to the water every single time we went out there, you know. But God calls us into these places where we don't want to go there. I don't want to go there. I don't want to do that. But on the other side is this experience with him and this reliance on him, and you push past that fear and that awkwardness and that whatever it is, that barrier that keeps you from moving into that space. And there's an amazing amount of freedom that happens there. And there's this joy and this exhilaration that happens. It's like, you know, being on the edge of a cliff and before you jump, and then like you hit the water, and like the first thing you're like, oh, I got to do that again, you know. But there are people that never do that and never experience it. But those that do, it's like, oh, like you've broken the seal at that point. Like this is all I want to do.
It was terrifying, and then it's a thrill, and now I got to go again.
Yeah, that's life with God, for sure.
Yeah. It's really interesting, you know, because you said a lot of similar stuff to what my conversation with Jamie, different you know, versions of a journey that God seems to have brought, and you just cannot get away from. At some point, it's going to get uncomfortable. It's going to get scary. You're not going to be able to touch the bottom. Yeah. And God is going, that's right where I want you, you know, because that's where he really teaches us some lessons about dependence on him and what that means. And so I want to wrap up with this, you know, we're wrapping up this series. Why should people, you know, kind of with the cliff jumping analogy, but why should people just continue this pursuit of a love relationship with God? That's kind of the destination we're all going for on this faith journey. You know, why should we keep pursuing that thing, even when it gets hard, uncomfortable, full of fear? What would you say?
I believe there's an experience of God that he wants us all to participate in. And it's a type of relationship that's unlike anything else we can ever experience. And fear is our greatest enemy. Fear of looking stupid, being wrong, fear of what other people are going to say. It keeps us from doing a lot, and it steals a lot of the joy. But God is patient, and he's kind, and he's compassionate, and he wants us to have the kind of relationship with him where it's just like you and I talking right now across the table from one another, and that everyone has access to that. That's what Jesus gave us. He gave us the ability to have that kind of relationship with him that didn't exist before. It's so counter to everything we're taught, you know?
Yeah.
And it's so counter to the way the world operates, because the world operates by work harder, know the right people, get the right job, have the right thing, get it all together, right? And that there's a reason why the world is one of the things we fight against, you know, the world, the flesh, and the enemy, right? I mean, those are the weapons the enemy uses against us. And God wants us, it's like there's this, he knows there's like his ability to see all things in all time. And there's a greater portion that he's assigned for us, that he has chosen for us. And this is one of the things about the freedom of choice, right? God gives us the ability to say yes to him. He gives us the ability to say no to him. And my experience has always been that by saying yes, there's always something deeper. There's always something more. Glorious is not really the right word I want to use, but I found myself becoming a better father, a better friend, a better husband. Being the deeper and more intimate relationship I have with a father, the more mature I'm becoming. And that starts with my yes. That starts with me saying, like I joke with people, I say, I'm not in the habit of telling no to God. And that's true. You know, if God says, hey, I want you to do this, or I feel like God's saying, I want you to do this, I don't say no to that typically. But when I do, he's patient, and he's like, okay, well, when you're ready. And eventually, life works its way out where like, oh, I really should have done that, or I really need to do that.
Yeah.
And he has so much for us, and he wants so much for us, but he's a lover. And he wants us to invite him, and he wants us to participate. And that is solely on our, like he's done all the work that's required. It's just we need to accept it. We need to like move into that. We need to live into that. And the biggest threshold I think people need to push past is probably that fear element.
Yeah.
That's why I use that cliff diving thing, because it is literally jumping into the unknown.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good way to wrap up. And I just want to encourage everybody listening or watching just to use that word you just said, participate. Just wherever you're at, if you're in trail marker 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever it is, just participate with God where you're at, and just open your hands up tonight, find a space alone, and just invite him in a way you haven't before, and just see what he does. Just see what he does in your life. Craig, thank you so much for talking.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sharing your story, sharing your wisdom. We're grateful for it, and we're excited for where we're picking up next week with a one-off message before we get to Christmas. So we'll see everybody on Sunday.